The November chill bit through Mason's thin jacket as he trudged along the outskirts of Pinewood, a small town nestled in the foothills of northern Georgia. At 12 years old, Mason Carter had already experienced more hardship than most adults. 6 months ago, his mother had been hospitalized after her long battle with addiction took a devastating turn, leaving Mason with nowhere to go but the streets. "Come on, Rusty," Mason whispered to the scraggly brown mutt trotting faithfully beside him. The dog's warm presence was his only constant companion since that rainy April day when he'd found the trembling puppy huddled beneath a dumpster behind the local diner. Mason adjusted his backpack, containing everything he owned: 2 t-shirts, a worn paperback novel, a small first aid kit stolen from the school nurse's office, and a plastic water bottle he refilled at public parks. His stomach growled painfully, reminding him that the half-sandwich Mrs. Greenwood from the bakery had slipped him yesterday morning was long gone. "We need to find somewhere warm tonight, buddy," Mason said, eyeing the darkening sky. The weather forecast had predicted temperatures dropping into the 30s, dangerous for anyone sleeping rough, especially a skinny kid and his underfed dog. Mason had developed a system over the months. He'd rotate between the bus station, the playground equipment at Willow Creek Park, and the loading dock behind the supermarket. Never staying in one place too long to avoid drawing attention. The social worker had almost caught him twice, and Mason knew what that meant: foster care and giving up Rusty. The thought made his chest tighten. The trail he followed now led deeper into the woods that bordered the eastern edge of town. Mason had discovered it weeks ago but rarely ventured this far in. Today, desperation drove him forward as the first snowflakes began to fall. "Look, Rusty," Mason pointed ahead where the trees thinned slightly. "Maybe there's a shed or something." What Mason found instead stopped him in his tracks. Partially hidden by overgrown vegetation and the gathering dusk stood an old trailer, its once white exterior now a patchwork of rust and faded paint. A broken window had been covered with what looked like a piece of plywood, and the small wooden steps leading to the door were rotting away. "Hello?" Mason called cautiously, his voice small against the vastness of the forest. Only the gentle patter of snowflakes answered him. Rusty sniffed the air, ears perked forward with interest rather than alarm, a good sign. The dog had proven to have better instincts about danger than Mason himself. Gathering his courage, Mason approached the trailer. The door was secured with a simple padlock that hung broken and useless. With a tentative push, the door creaked open to reveal a space untouched for what seemed like years. The smell hit him first, musty and damp, but not the putrid odor he'd feared. The interior was small but intact: a built-in sofa with faded upholstery, a tiny kitchenette with cabinets, and a narrow hallway presumably leading to a bathroom. "Look at this place, Rusty," Mason whispered, afraid to raise his voice as if the trailer might disappear if he acknowledged it too loudly. "Nobody's been here for ages." Mason carefully tested the sofa: no springs poking through, no evidence of rodents. The excitement building in his chest felt dangerous, like hope always did. He'd learned that lesson when his mother promised to get clean, when the school counselor said they'd find him help, when his father had promised to return years ago. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, the temperature dropping rapidly as night claimed the forest. Mason made a quick decision. They would stay, just for tonight. He unrolled his thin blanket on the sofa and sat down, Rusty immediately jumping up beside him. For the first time in months, they were sheltered from the elements completely. No rain seeping through playground equipment, no security guards to evade, no constant vigilance. "We have to be careful," Mason told Rusty, running his fingers through the dog's coarse fur. "This belongs to someone. We're just borrowing it until the snow stops." As darkness enveloped the forest around them, Mason's eyelids grew heavy. The relative safety of 4 walls and a roof, however dilapidated, was more comfort than he'd known since leaving home. Just before sleep claimed him, Mason whispered, "Tomorrow, we'll check if there's anything useful here, then figure out our next move." Rusty's steady breathing beside him was the last thing Mason registered before exhaustion pulled him under. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and enshrouding the forgotten trailer in a blanket of white, hiding them from the world that had forgotten them both. Mason woke with a start, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar ceiling above him. Sunlight streamed through the dirty windows of the trailer, casting mottled patterns across the worn linoleum floor. Beside him, Rusty was already awake, watching him with alert brown eyes. "Morning, boy," Mason said, his voice hoarse from the cold. The temperature inside the trailer was only marginally warmer than outside, but the relief of being shielded from the snow that had fallen overnight was immeasurable. Sitting up, Mason took proper stock of their surroundings in the daylight. What he had initially mistaken for abandonment revealed itself as something more complicated. While dust covered most surfaces, there were signs that someone had lived here more recently than he'd first thought. A faded calendar on the wall marked events from just 2 years ago, a few canned goods still lined a small shelf in the kitchenette. "Let's explore a bit," Mason suggested, swinging his legs off the sofa. His body ached from months of inadequate rest, but he felt more refreshed than he had in weeks. The trailer was small but efficiently designed. Beyond the main living area with the kitchenette was a tiny bathroom with a shower stall and toilet. To his surprise, when he tentatively turned the faucet, a weak stream of rust-colored water sputtered out before running clear. The property must still be connected to some water source. "Running water, Rusty," Mason whispered, almost afraid to believe their luck. He could wash, fill his water bottle, maybe even get properly clean for the first time in weeks. Mason returned to the main area and began carefully opening cabinets. The first contained mismatched dishes covered in dust. The second held a few basic tools, a hammer, screwdrivers, a roll of duct tape. In the third, he found a jackpot, several cans of soup, beans, and vegetables with expiration dates still months away. "Whoever left this place didn't take everything," Mason observed, his hunger making his hands shake slightly as he examined the cans. He hadn't stolen food since the early days. It had felt too much like what his father used to do, but this was different. These items were abandoned, forgotten. While Mason inventoried their discovery, Rusty had grown restless. The dog was pawing at the edge of a threadbare rug near the back of the trailer, whining softly in the way that usually meant he'd found something interesting. "What is it, boy?" Mason asked, setting down a can of beef stew to investigate. Rusty continued scratching at the corner of the rug, and Mason knelt down to pull it back. Underneath was nothing but the same linoleum floor, slightly less faded where the rug had protected it from sunlight. Mason was about to replace the rug when he noticed something odd, a slight depression in one section of the floor, with what appeared to be the outline of a trapdoor. "What the heck?" Mason murmured, running his fingers along the nearly invisible seam. His fingertips caught on a small notch, and when he applied pressure, a section of the floor lifted slightly. His heart racing, Mason pried up the camouflaged panel to reveal a small storage compartment built into the floor of the trailer. Inside lay a metal lockbox, approximately the size of a shoebox. "Good boy, Rusty," Mason whispered, patting the dog's head as he lifted out the box. It wasn't particularly heavy, but something shifted inside when he moved it. The box was secured with a simple combination lock. Mason sat cross-legged on the floor, examining his discovery with equal parts curiosity and caution. Breaking into the box felt like crossing a line. This wasn't just taking shelter or even consuming abandoned food. This was deliberately accessing something someone had hidden. "What would you do, Mom?" he whispered to himself. Before the drugs took her away piece by piece, his mother had taught him right from wrong. But she had also taught him about survival. After several minutes of deliberation, Mason decided to leave the box unopened, at least for now. He placed it on the small folding table and turned his attention to more pressing concerns, warmth and food. In a closet near the bathroom, Mason discovered a kerosene heater with a half-full fuel tank. With careful attention to the instructions printed on its side, he managed to get it working, filling the small space with blessed heat. "We hit the jackpot, Rusty," Mason said, opening a can of beef stew and pouring half into a dusty bowl for himself and half onto a plate for Rusty. The dog ate eagerly while Mason savored each spoonful, allowing himself to believe, just for a moment, that things might be okay. As afternoon light filtered through the windows, Mason began to clean. If they were going to stay here, even temporarily, he wanted it to feel less abandoned. He wiped down surfaces, swept the floor with a broom he found in the closet, and washed the bedding from the small built-in bed in the back of the trailer. Throughout it all, the lockbox sat on the table, an unanswered question. As dusk approached, Mason sat across from it, Rusty's head resting on his lap. "Someone cared enough to hide this," he said to Rusty, running his fingers along the combination lock. "But they also left it behind." The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees and rattling the trailer's thin walls. The thought of returning to the streets, especially with winter settling in, made Mason's chest tighten with anxiety. "We'll stay through the weekend," he decided aloud. "Clean up, rest, get stronger. Then we'll figure out what to do next." As darkness fell once more, Mason lay on the freshly cleaned bed, Rusty curled at his feet. Despite the uncertainty of their situation, for the first time in months, Mason fell asleep with something dangerous blooming in his chest: hope. 3 days had passed since Mason and Rusty discovered the trailer, and the initial snowfall had given way to a lingering cold snap that gripped the region. Mason sat by the small window, watching his breath form clouds in the chilly air despite the efforts of the kerosene heater he'd managed to coax to life. The lockbox remained unopened on the table, a constant presence in Mason's thoughts. Each time he considered trying to break into it, something held him back, a mixture of respect for boundaries and fear of what crossing that line might mean. "What do you think is inside, Rusty?" Mason asked, his voice echoing slightly in the small space. The dog lifted his head from his paws, ears perking up at the sound of his name, but offered no insight into the mystery. Their food situation had improved somewhat. Mason had discovered a few more canned goods tucked away in a corner cabinet, and he'd managed to catch rainwater in a bucket left outside, allowing them to conserve the trailer's sporadic water supply. Still, he knew they couldn't stay indefinitely without more resources. Mason pulled out the worn photo of his mother he kept in his backpack, a snapshot from before, when her smile reached her eyes and her arms were unmarked by needle tracks. He traced her face with his fingertip. "I wonder if she's looking for me," he whispered. The hospital had told him visitors weren't allowed during the initial detox period, and by the time he'd gone back, they'd transferred her to a residential treatment facility. Without an address or phone, he had no way of leaving a message for her. For all he knew, she might believe he'd been placed in foster care by now. The thought spurred Mason to action. Carefully bundling up in his layers, he told Rusty, "I need to check town. Stay here and guard our place, okay?" Rusty whined softly but settled back down as Mason stepped outside. The cold immediately bit through his inadequate clothing, but the sun was shining, making the snow-covered forest blindingly bright. Mason had carefully memorized landmarks on their way in: a lightning-struck tree, an unusual rock formation, the way the path curved around a small creek, ensuring he could find his way back. In town, Mason kept his head down as he passed the small police station, aware that Officer Daniels had been watching for him since his disappearance from school. His first stop was the community bulletin board outside the library, where he sometimes found notices about free meals or warming centers. Today, something new caught his eye: a handwritten note pinned to the cork. "Mason, if you see this, please call. I'm out and doing better. Miss you. Love, Mom." Below was a phone number Mason didn't recognize. His heart hammered in his chest as he quickly copied the number onto his palm with a discarded pen. The note was dated just 2 days ago. His mother was out of treatment, looking for him. Mason debated his next move. The public library had phones, but they required a library card, which he'd left behind at their apartment. The convenience store had a pay phone, but he had no change. As he pondered his options, a familiar voice called his name. Mason Carter, is that you? He turned to see Mrs. Peterson, his former English teacher, emerging from the library with a stack of books. Her eyes widened as she took in his appearance, thinner than before, clothes dirty despite his best efforts to stay clean. "Hi, Mrs. Peterson," Mason replied, fighting the urge to run. Mrs. Peterson had always been kind to him, slipping him extra snacks when she thought no one was looking, never asking questions when he fell asleep in class. "We've all been worried sick about you," she said, approaching slowly as if afraid he might bolt. "Your mother's been looking everywhere since she got back." "I saw her note," Mason admitted, showing his palm with the scribbled number. "I was trying to figure out how to call her." Mrs. Peterson's expression softened. "Would you like to use my phone?" 20 minutes later, Mason sat in Mrs. Peterson's car, having just finished an emotional call with his mother. Teresa Carter had been clean for 68 days, the longest stretch in years. She'd moved them into a small apartment on the other side of town, found a job at the hospital laundry facility, and was attending daily meetings. "She wants me to come home," Mason said, his voice barely audible. "That's wonderful," Mrs. Peterson replied, careful to keep her tone neutral. "How do you feel about that?" Mason stared out the window. "I don't know. She's tried before. It never lasts." "That's true," Mrs. Peterson acknowledged, surprising Mason with her honesty. "Recovery isn't a straight line. But she's putting in the work this time, calling the school, putting up notices, even working with the police to find you without getting you in trouble." Mason thought of the trailer in the woods, the temporary sanctuary he and Rusty had found. "I have somewhere to stay right now." "It's complicated." Mrs. Peterson nodded slowly. "Would you consider a compromise? What if you called your mom every day from my classroom phone after school lets out? Take some time to see if she's really committed this time." The suggestion offered a lifeline, a way to reconnect without immediately abandoning the safety he'd established. "Could I do that?" "Of course," she assured him. "And Mason? Whatever you decide, please know you're not alone anymore. I can help with food, warm clothes, whatever you need while you figure things out." As Mrs. Peterson drove him back to the edge of town as requested, Mason felt a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. For the first time in months, he had options that didn't involve constant survival calculations. Walking back through the snowy forest to the trailer, Mason made his decision. He would give his mother time to prove herself while maintaining his independence. The trailer would remain his sanctuary for now, a secret place where he and Rusty could be safe as he cautiously rebuilt the bridge to his former life. A week after reconnecting with his mother, Mason had settled into a new routine. Each afternoon, he would carefully make his way into town, call his mother from Mrs. Peterson's classroom phone, and collect the small care packages she'd begun leaving there for him: nutritious food, clean clothes, new socks, and once, a sturdy backpack to replace his fraying one. Today, however, Mrs. Peterson had been in a meeting, and the school office was busier than usual, making Mason too nervous to wait around. Instead, he'd headed to the public library, where he spent hours researching survival techniques and, more importantly, information about the mysterious lockbox that still sat unopened in the trailer. "Rusty, I brought dinner," Mason called as he entered the trailer, stomping snow from his boots. The dog bounded toward him, tail wagging enthusiastically. "And I figured out how we might be able to open that box." During his library research, Mason had discovered several methods for opening combination locks without damaging them. After numerous failed attempts at guessing the combination, he was ready to try something more direct. Setting out the sandwich and apple Mrs. Peterson had given him earlier, Mason turned his attention to the lockbox. Following the instructions he'd memorized, he began methodically testing combinations, focusing on common patterns and listening for subtle clicks within the mechanism. Nearly 2 hours later, when the winter darkness had fully descended outside, Mason heard the distinctive click he'd been waiting for. The lock sprang open in his hands. "We did it, Rusty," he whispered, his heart pounding. With trembling fingers, he lifted the lid of the box. Inside, neatly organized, lay several items that immediately told a story. On top was a stack of crisp $100 bills. Mason quickly counted 15 of them. Beneath the money was a small leather journal, a tarnished silver pocket watch, and a folded document that appeared to be a deed of ownership for the trailer and the small parcel of land it occupied. The most surprising item, however, was a sealed envelope with, "To whoever finds this," written in neat cursive across the front. Mason carefully opened the envelope and extracted a single-page letter. To the finder of this box. If you're reading this, you've either broken into my home, shame on you, or found this place abandoned and in need of shelter, in which case, welcome. My name is Harold Jenkins. By the time you find this, I'll likely have passed on or moved to assisted living as my doctor keeps insisting. This trailer and the 5 acres surrounding it have been my home for 23 years since my dear wife Margaret died. I have no children or family to leave it to, and no desire to see it fall into the hands of developers who would destroy the peace of these woods. The money is yours to use as needed. Consider it rent paid in advance if you're staying, or a lucky windfall if you're just passing through. The deed is legitimate and transferred to occupant through a legal trick my attorney friend helped with before he retired. All I ask is that you respect the land. The North Creek has trout in spring. Wild blackberries grow along the eastern fence line in summer. The winter nights get cold, but the sunrises make it worthwhile. If you choose to stay, this place is now yours. If not, please leave this box for the next person who might need it more than either of us. Wishing you well, Harold Jenkins, December 18, 2021. Mason read the letter twice, then a third time, his mind struggling to process its implications. The trailer wasn't abandoned, it had been deliberately left for someone like him to find. The legal document, when he carefully unfolded it, confirmed what the letter suggested: ownership had been transferred to current occupant through some kind of legal arrangement. Rusty, Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper, I think we just inherited a home. The reality of the situation slowly dawned on him. This wasn't just temporary shelter, this could be a permanent solution. A place where he could stay while his mother continued her recovery, where they could potentially live together once he was certain her sobriety would last, where Rusty would always be welcome. Opening the journal, Mason discovered detailed notes about the property, where the septic tank was located, how to restart the water pump when it froze, which trees were safe to harvest for firewood, and dozens of other practical tips for living off-grid. Harold Jenkins had essentially left behind a manual for survival in this isolated woodland sanctuary. As the implications sank in, Mason felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude toward the man he'd never met. Harold Jenkins had created a lifeline for someone in need, expecting nothing in return except respect for the land he'd loved. We should do something to thank him, Mason told Rusty, who had settled beside him, head resting on his paw. Even if he's not here anymore. That night, as the temperature dropped and wind whistled through the trees outside, Mason made 2 important decisions. First, he would use some of the money to properly repair and improve the trailer, honoring Harold's gift by taking care of the place. Second, he would tell his mother about the trailer, not immediately, but soon, once he was more confident in her recovery. For the first time since his mother had entered the hospital 6 months ago, Mason fell asleep without the gnawing anxiety that had become his constant companion. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he faced them now with resources, knowledge, and most importantly, a place to call home. The following Saturday dawned bright and cold, with sunlight streaming through the trailer windows, casting long golden rectangles across the floor. Mason had spent the week planning, making lists, and carefully studying Harold's journal to understand exactly what the trailer needed. With $500 carefully tucked into his pocket, a sum that still seemed unreal to him, Mason had arranged to meet Mrs. Peterson at the hardware store on the edge of town. He'd told her about the trailer, though not about the money or deed, explaining only that he'd found an abandoned place that needed some work to be properly habitable. "Good morning, Mason," Mrs. Peterson greeted him in the parking lot, her breath visible in the cold air. "Are you sure you don't want me to see this place of yours?" I could help with the repairs. Mason shook his head. Not yet. I want to fix it up first. The truth was, he wasn't ready to share his sanctuary with anyone besides Rusty, not even someone as trustworthy as Mrs. Peterson. But I could really use help getting the supplies back there. Together they filled a cart with essential repair items: silicone sealant for the windows, a replacement pane for the broken one, insulation strips for the doors, a small space heater that would be more efficient than the kerosene one, heavy-duty trash bags, cleaning supplies, and basic tools. You seem to know exactly what you need, Mrs. Peterson observed as Mason carefully compared two different types of wood filler. I've been researching, he replied, selecting the waterproof option. And the previous owner left some notes about maintenance. When they reached the register, Mason pulled out the money, noticing Mrs. Peterson's surprised expression. My mom, he explained quickly. She gave me some money for supplies. The lie tasted bitter, but he wasn't ready to explain the truth. Mrs. Peterson drove him as close to the trail as possible, helping him load the supplies into two large backpacks and a sled he'd purchased for hauling the heavier items through the snow. Call me from the library if you need anything else, she said as he prepared to head into the woods. And Mason? You're still coming to call your mother tomorrow, right? Definitely, he assured her. His daily calls with his mother had been going well. Teresa was now 69 days sober, attending meetings, and working steady hours. She spoke about making amends, about doing things differently, with a clarity Mason hadn't heard in years. He was cautiously optimistic but still wary of fully committing to returning home. The journey back to the trailer was arduous, requiring 3 trips to transport all the supplies. By midday, Mason had everything spread out on the trailer floor, organized by repair priority. First things first, he told Rusty, who watched with interest from the sofa. We need to fix that window before it gets dark. Working methodically, Mason replaced the broken window pane, sealed all the windows against drafts, and installed the insulation strips around the door. The difference was immediately noticeable. The persistent chill that had permeated the trailer began to dissipate. Next, he tackled the water system. Following Harold's detailed notes, Mason located the small pump that drew water from a deep well near the trailer. The system was ingeniously simple, designed to operate with minimal electricity from a small solar panel mounted on the roof. After cleaning sediment from the filters as instructed in the journal, the water pressure improved dramatically. As dusk approached, Mason connected the new space heater, feeling a surge of satisfaction as warm air began to circulate. The trailer was already beginning to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a real home. That evening, sitting at the small table with Rusty curled at his feet, Mason opened Harold's journal again. Beyond the practical information about the property, there were personal entries, reflections on seasons changing, wildlife sightings, and memories of Margaret, Harold's late wife. The entries painted a picture of a man who had found peace in solitude without succumbing to loneliness. An entry from 5 years earlier caught Mason's attention: found a boy camping near the creek today. Couldn't be more than 16, clearly on his own. Invited him for dinner, but he was too scared to come inside. Left food by his tent and kept my distance. He was gone the next morning, but the empty plate was washed and left with a note: thanks. This place has always attracted those who need sanctuary. Maybe that's why Margaret insisted we buy this particular plot all those years ago. Mason realized then that he wasn't the first person to find refuge here. Harold had created this place with people like him in mind, people who needed temporary sanctuary while they found their path forward. The next day, Mason continued his restoration project, cleaning years of dust from corners, organizing the small storage areas, and making lists of additional supplies he would need. In a cabinet beneath the sink, he discovered cans of paint, forest green and warm cream, likely intended for an exterior refresh that Harold never completed. What do you think, Rusty? Should we paint it when spring comes? The dog's enthusiastic tail wagging seemed answer enough. By Sunday evening, the transformation was remarkable. The trailer was clean, warm, and secure. Small touches, a thermal blanket on the sofa, battery-operated lights strung across one wall, a proper dog bed for Rusty, had turned the space from merely habitable to genuinely comfortable. As Mason prepared for bed, his daily call with his mother replayed in his mind. She'd sounded better than ever, excited about a potential promotion at work, proud of her 70 days of sobriety. For the first time, she'd asked directly when he might come home, and for the first time, he'd given her a tentative answer instead of deflecting. Maybe next weekend, he'd said, surprising himself as much as her. Just to visit. To see how it feels. The prospect was both terrifying and hopeful. Mason wasn't ready to abandon the trailer, his trailer now, according to Harold's deed, but he was increasingly ready to test the fragile bridge being rebuilt between him and his mother. "We're going to be okay, Rusty," Mason whispered as he drifted toward sleep. "Whatever happens next, we have options now. We have a home." The bus ride across town to his mother's new apartment felt surreal. Mason sat rigid in his seat, Rusty nestled in a carrier at his feet. Mrs. Peterson had helped him obtain a temporary service animal vest to allow Rusty on public transportation. In his backpack was a carefully wrapped package, a small gift he'd selected with Harold's money, a ceramic mug with painted pine trees that reminded him of the woods surrounding the trailer. "It's just a visit," Mason reminded himself quietly. "We're not staying." In the 3 weeks since discovering Harold's lockbox, Mason had transformed the trailer into a proper home while cautiously rebuilding his relationship with his mother through daily phone calls. Teresa was now 77 days sober, her longest stretch in years, and something in her voice had changed. The foggy distance that had characterized their conversations during her previous attempts at sobriety had been replaced by a clear-eyed presence that gave Mason cautious hope. As the bus pulled up to the stop nearest his mother's new apartment, Mason felt his stomach twist with anxiety. He'd agreed to this visit after much encouragement from Mrs. Peterson, who had gently suggested that seeing his mother's progress firsthand might help him make decisions about his future. The apartment building was modest but well-maintained, with potted plants flanking the entrance. Mason checked the address twice before climbing the stairs to the second floor, Rusty's carrier growing heavy in his hand. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Teresa Carter stood in the doorway, her face breaking into a smile that reminded Mason of photographs from before the addiction, before their lives had unraveled. She looked healthier than he had seen her in years, her hair neatly trimmed, her face fuller, her eyes clear. "Mason," she whispered, as if afraid speaking too loudly might make him disappear. "You came." For a moment, neither moved. Then Teresa stepped back, gesturing into the apartment. "Please, come in. Both of you." The apartment was small but immaculate. A living room with a second-hand sofa opened to a kitchenette where something savory simmered on the stove. A short hallway presumably led to a bedroom and bathroom. What struck Mason most was the evidence of permanence, framed photographs on the walls, including several of him from younger, happier days, houseplants thriving on windowsills, a bookshelf filled with paperbacks. "You can let Rusty out," Teresa said, nodding to the carrier. "I made sure the landlord allows pets. Paid the deposit and everything." Mason unzipped the carrier, and Rusty emerged cautiously, sniffing the new environment. Teresa knelt slowly, extending her hand for the dog to inspect. After a moment's hesitation, Rusty gave her fingers a tentative lick. "He's beautiful," she said, looking up at Mason. "You've taken good care of him." "He's taken good care of me too," Mason replied, his voice catching slightly. The afternoon unfolded with less awkwardness than Mason had feared. They ate the stew Teresa had prepared, his favorite recipe from when he was younger, and she showed him around the apartment, including the small second bedroom she had set up for him, complete with a new comforter and a desk for schoolwork. "I know you might not be ready to stay," she said carefully, watching his expression. "But I wanted you to see that there's a place for you here. For both of you," she added, glancing at Rusty, who had settled comfortably on a rug by the sofa. After dinner, Teresa took a deep breath and reached for a folder on the coffee table. "I want to show you something," she said, opening it to reveal documents, treatment completion certificates, pay stubs, a bank statement showing a small but growing savings account, and a calendar marked with meeting attendance. "I'm doing the work, Mason. Really doing it this time." "What's different?" Mason asked, the question that had been burning in him for months finally surfacing. "You've tried before." Teresa nodded, accepting the challenge in his question. "Before, I was getting sober for other people, the courts, the social workers, even for you. This time, I'm doing it for myself because I finally understand what I've lost." She looked directly at him. "Not just you, but years of my life, my self-respect, everything that matters." She pulled one last document from the folder, a lease agreement for the apartment, signed for a full year. "I'm not going anywhere, Mason. Whether you decide to come home tomorrow or next month or never, I'm still going to be sober, still going to be working my program, still going to be here loving you and hoping." Something in her steady gaze, in the quiet determination of her words, reached a part of Mason that had been protected behind walls of disappointment and fear. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly consider the possibility that this time might be different. As the evening grew late, Teresa asked the question Mason had been dreading. "Where have you been staying all this time? Mrs. Peterson said you're somewhere safe, but she wouldn't tell me more." Mason hesitated, then reached into his backpack and pulled out Harold's journal. "I found a place," he said simply, passing her the journal. "Someone left it for people who needed it." As Teresa read Harold's story and examined the deed Mason had brought to show her, her expression shifted from concern to wonder. "This is incredible, Mason. You found a home." "It's not much," Mason admitted. "Just a trailer in the woods. But it's quiet and private, and there's enough land that Rusty can run around." Teresa handed the journal back, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "You've survived in ways I never could have at your age." As the time came for Mason to leave, he had arranged for Mrs. Peterson to pick him up. Teresa walked him to the door. "Would you," she began, then paused, visibly gathering her courage. "Would you show me your place sometime? No pressure to stay here. I just want to see where my son has been living." The request surprised him, but after a moment's consideration, Mason nodded. "Maybe next weekend. If things keep going well." The smile that lit his mother's face was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." As Mason walked toward Mrs. Peterson's waiting car, Rusty trotting beside him, he felt something shift inside, the first cautious dismantling of the walls he'd built around his heart. The bridge between his past and future was beginning to take shape, built one careful conversation at a time. "Are you sure about this?" Mrs. Peterson asked as she turned her car onto the narrow dirt road that led toward the trailhead. In the back seat, Teresa sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "We can always do this another day." "I'm sure," Mason replied from the passenger seat. Rusty sat alert between his feet, sensing the importance of the day. "It's time." It had been 2 weeks since Mason's first visit to his mother's apartment. In that time, he had visited twice more, each visit ending with less tension and more genuine conversation. Teresa had now reached 90 days of sobriety, a milestone her recovery group had celebrated with a special medallion she kept in her pocket, running her fingers over it when anxiety struck. Today marked a significant step. Mason had finally agreed to show his mother the trailer, the sanctuary that had saved him during the coldest months of his homelessness. The decision hadn't come easily. The trailer represented independence, safety, and control, all things Mason had lacked during his mother's worst periods of addiction. "We'll have to walk the last half-mile," Mason explained as Mrs. Peterson parked where the road ended. "The trail's too narrow for cars." Teresa nodded, pulling on the hiking boots Mason had suggested she wear. "I'm ready," she said, her determination evident in her voice. The forest was transforming as spring approached. Snow remained in shaded areas, but patches of ground had emerged, displaying the first tender shoots of woodland plants. Birds called from budding branches overhead as the 3 humans and 1 dog made their way along the winding trail. "It's beautiful out here," Teresa commented, her breath visible in the still cool air. "So peaceful." Mason nodded, leading the way with the confidence of someone returning home. "Wait until you see the clearing." Harold, the man who owned the place before, he planted wildflowers all around the trailer. The journal says they bloom in late April. As they rounded the final bend in the trailer came into view. Mason had been busy in the weeks since discovering Harold's gift. The exterior had been cleaned, the steps rebuilt with lumber he'd carefully carried in, and the small yard surrounding it cleared of debris. Though still modest, the trailer no longer looked abandoned, it looked cared for. "Oh, Mason," Teresa whispered, taking in the scene. "You did all this yourself?" Pride warmed Mason's chest as he nodded. "Most of it. Mrs. Peterson helped with some of the heavier stuff." "I mostly just drove supplies," Mrs. Peterson corrected, giving Mason's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "He did the real work." Leading them inside, Mason watched nervously as his mother took in the interior he'd worked so hard to transform. The walls were freshly painted in the warm cream color Harold had left behind. The furniture had been cleaned and repaired, with new cushions on the built-in sofa. Mason had added small touches to make the space his own, a collection of interesting stones on a shelf, drawings of Rusty pinned to the wall, books borrowed from the library stacked neatly by the bed. "This is incredible," Teresa said, running her hand along the small counter in the kitchenette. "You've made a real home here." "It's not much," Mason said, echoing his words from their previous conversation, though with less defensiveness this time. "It's everything," Teresa countered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's safety and independence and proof of how capable you are." She took a deep breath. "I understand now why you might not want to leave this to come back to the apartment." The acknowledgement caught Mason by surprise. He had expected her to try to convince him to return, to argue that a 12-year-old belonged with his mother regardless of how well he'd managed on his own. "I've been thinking about that," Mason said carefully, having rehearsed these words many times. "What if we didn't have to choose?" Teresa tilted her head questioningly. "Harold left 5 acres with this trailer," Mason continued, pulling out the property map he'd found in the lockbox. "The deed is legal. Mrs. Peterson had a lawyer friend check it. There's plenty of room for something else besides just the trailer." Eventually, understanding dawned on Teresa's face. "You mean building something more permanent? Here?" Mason nodded. "Not right away. We'd need money, permits, lots of stuff. But maybe someday, if things keep going well, we could build a small house. Something big enough for both of us, but close enough to town for you to get to work. Harold's journal talks about how to live out here year-round." The possibility hung in the air between them, a future neither had dared imagine just months earlier. "And until then?" Teresa asked gently. "I was thinking maybe I could split my time," Mason suggested. "Some nights at the apartment, some nights here. At least until school lets out for summer. I'd still need to see you're really staying sober," Teresa finished for him, no offense in her tone. "That's fair, Mason. More than fair." Mrs. Peterson, who had been quietly observing their conversation, spoke up. "I think that sounds like a wonderful compromise. And I'm happy to help with transportation until other arrangements can be made." As they settled around the small table for the picnic lunch Teresa had prepared, Mason felt a weight lifting that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. For so long, he had seen his options as binary: return to the instability of life with his mother or maintain his independence at the cost of losing his only family. The possibility of a middle path, of rebuilding trust while maintaining the safety net he'd created, felt like finding solid ground after months of uncertainty. Later, As they walked the property lines according to Harold's map, Teresa stopped at the edge of a small clearing about 200 yards from the trailer. "This would be a perfect spot," she said, gesturing to the level ground. "Good drainage, morning sun. We could start with something small, maybe just a cabin at first." "We?" Mason asked, the word catching in his throat. Teresa turned to him, her expression open and vulnerable. "If you'll have me as a partner in this, Mason. It would be your project too, your land, your decision." As Rusty bounded through the undergrowth, chasing spring smells and new adventures, Mason looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't seen in years: clarity, presence, and the mother he remembered from before everything fell apart. "I'd like that," he said simply. Partners. Summer arrived in a riot of green, transforming the woods around the trailer into a lush haven. True to Harold's notes, wildflowers had erupted in a colorful display around the clearing, attracting hummingbirds and butterflies that Rusty watched with fascinated attention. 4 months had passed since Mason had shown his mother the trailer, and in that time, their tentative rebuilding had solidified into something neither had dared hope for: a genuine partnership. Teresa had remained steadfastly committed to her sobriety, now approaching 6 months clean. Mason had gradually increased his time at the apartment, eventually enrolling in summer school to make up the credits he'd missed during his months of homelessness. Today marked the beginning of a new chapter. Mason stood at the edge of the clearing where, months earlier, his mother had envisioned their future home. Now, wooden stakes connected by bright orange string marked the foundation of what would become a small cabin, the first phase of their long-term plan. "They're late," Teresa observed, checking her watch as she joined Mason in the clearing. Her weekends were now dedicated to the property, her weekdays spent at the hospital where she'd recently been promoted to laundry supervisor. "Only 10 minutes, Mason replied, his attention on Rusty, who was enthusiastically digging near the tree line. "Rusty. Leave whatever poor creature that is alone." The sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention. First came Mrs. Peterson's familiar sedan, followed by a pickup truck laden with lumber and tools. Behind them, 2 more cars made their way carefully along the improved access road, the result of Mason's first major expenditure from Harold's money after consulting with a lawyer who had confirmed the legitimacy of the gift. As the small caravan parked in the newly created parking area, Mason felt a surge of gratitude. What had begun as Mrs. Peterson's suggestion, "I know some people who might be willing to help with a building project," had evolved into something larger than he could have imagined. From the vehicles emerged an unlikely construction crew: Mr. Harmon, Mason's former math teacher, who had apparently built 3 houses before becoming an educator; Officer Daniels, whose initial search for Mason had transformed into genuine concern for his welfare; 2 recovery friends from Teresa's support group, and to Mason's surprise, Sarah Winters, a classmate who had once shared her lunch with him when his stomach growled too loudly to ignore. "Hope you don't mind I came," Sarah said, approaching somewhat shyly. "My dad's a contractor, and I've been helping him since I was little. Mrs. Peterson thought I might be useful." "Definitely," Mason assured her, surprised by how pleased he felt at her presence. "We need all the help we can get." The day unfolded in a blur of activity. Under Mr. Harmon's direction, the team marked and dug the foundation holes, mixed concrete, and set the posts that would support the cabin's raised floor, essential in an area prone to spring flooding, according to Harold's meticulous notes. Teresa moved among the helpers, distributing water and the sandwiches she'd prepared, her ease with the group a testament to how far she'd come in rebuilding her life. Mason caught her in conversation with Officer Daniels, both laughing at something, the past tensions between them apparently resolved. "Your mom's doing really well," Mrs. Peterson commented, pausing beside Mason as he carefully leveled a support beam. "You both are." Mason nodded, unable to find words for the complex emotions swirling within him. Just months ago, he had been alone except for Rusty, sleeping in parks and behind stores, convinced his life would never improve. Now, he stood on land that was legally his, surrounded by people who had shown up simply because they cared. As the afternoon sun began to wane, the foundation took shape, not just the physical one of concrete and wood, but the metaphorical one of community and possibility. The cabin would be simple: 2 bedrooms, a combined living area and kitchen, a small bathroom. But it represented so much more than just shelter. "All right, folks," Mr. Harmon called, wiping sweat from his brow. "That's as far as we'll get today. The concrete needs to set before we start on the floor joists. Same time next Saturday?" As the group packed up tools and prepared to leave, Teresa approached Mason, who was studying the site with a critical eye. "What do you think?" she asked, following his gaze across the day's work. "Is it what you imagined?" Mason considered the question. "It's better," he said finally. "I never imagined all these people would care enough to help." Teresa slipped an arm around his shoulders, a gesture that had once felt foreign but now brought comfort. "People surprise you sometimes," she said softly. "When you let them in." Later, after everyone had gone except Teresa, who would stay in the trailer with him until morning, Mason took Rusty for their evening walk along the creek that bordered the property. The summer twilight lingered, casting long shadows across the water where Harold had noted trout could be found in the deeper pools. As Rusty splashed happily along the bank, Mason pulled Harold's journal from his pocket. He had read it cover to cover multiple times, finding new insights with each reading. Today, a passage he'd underlined months ago resonated with particular significance. "The woods taught me that nothing is truly permanent, yet nothing really ends either. The trees fall and become nurse logs for new saplings. The creek changes course but always flows. Margaret is gone, yet I feel her in every sunrise. Perhaps that's what matters most, not fighting change, but finding the continuity within it." Mason looked back toward the trailer where warm light spilled from the windows, and beyond it to the clearing where the foundation of their future home now stood. In the months since finding the rusty trailer in the woods, his life had transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined. The broken pieces had not simply been repaired but rearranged into something new and unexpectedly beautiful. Rusty bounded back to his side, fur damp from the creek, eyes bright with canine joy. Mason knelt to ruffle the dog's ears, overwhelmed by a sudden wave of gratitude for the loyal companion who had led him to the hidden door, the lockbox, and through it all, to a future bright with possibility. "Come on, boy," he said, rising to his feet. "Let's go home." As they walked back toward the lights of the trailer, Mason reflected that home was no longer just a place of physical safety. Home had expanded to include his rekindled relationship with his mother, the community that had formed around them, and the foundation, both literal and figurative, upon which they were building their future, one careful, deliberate step at a time. If you've made it this far, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next stories. Leave us a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support inspires us to keep creating content like this. Thank you for being here with us.